Hello, and thank you for joining us for this session on climate-ready smart cities, preparing for the future. I'm Swenja Surminski from the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics. In this session, we want to explore the important role that cities play in the fight against climate change. Cities are home to more than half of the world's population. They are economic powerhouses, innovation hubs, the place where people come together and seek better lives. But cities are also under pressure. They need energy and water, they produce emissions and pollution, and they suffer from transport gridlock and social challenges. And many are already experiencing the challenges that climate change brings. Floods, storms, heat waves are impacting cities all around the world. In my institute, as part of the Flood Resilience Alliance, we're working with cities around the world to assist them in their quest to become more resilient, developing ways to become more proactive and prevent, reduce, rather than repair and rebuild. So there are many promising examples, but the pressure is growing. And let's explore today in this session how policymakers can address these challenges, how cities can be transformed to be net zero climate resilient, and what roles and businesses and communities can play. I'm delighted to be joined by 5 stellar speakers for this session who've all worked on solutions for these urban challenges. To begin with, I will be joined by Anna König Jerlmyr, the mayor of Stockholm, for an interview. We will then widen the discussion by going into a panel. Anna, thank you so much for joining us. Those of us who had a chance to visit your city know how beautiful it is. And apparently it's also a very smart city. I think in November 2019, Stockholm was awarded the World Smart City Award. So what makes your city smart?
I have to say that it is the people and the entrepreneurs living here that coming together, and more we can see that they are purpose driven. We have changed our way of seeing entrepreneurs from, financial unicorns to impact entrepreneurs. So more and more are investing in a sustainable entrepreneurship. And you can see that also within the city, that they are looking for sustainable investments and solutions. So it's the politicians, but we work very closely with the citizens and with the business community for smart, sustainable solutions together with the citizens. And we have many examples, but one is, for example, to work a lot more with sensors so we can proactively create better policies for the future. And as was mentioned, the city needs to mitigate emissions, but we also have to be ready to adapt for climate change. So we are working together with the universities in the city of Stockholm, with MIT, but also our technical university to create sensors on cars where we can proactively measure upcoming heat waves in the city upcoming 10 years. So we know exactly what kind of areas in the city needs to be greener, for example. That's just one example where we work with academia, but also to find smarter solutions when it comes to clean the water, drinking water from microplastic and so on. So we are investing a lot with that. And I think that is a smart city, where you think of a city as from a holistic perspective, not only the city as a consumer, but also, as was mentioned in the beginning, to reuse materials, to see waste as assets, to think much more of a circular kind of way to use materials. And then the city can go from consumer to more like urban mining and use what is within the city boundaries and see it as renewable material or material that can be reused, especially within the building sector.
So, you really present a vision there of the sustainable city, but do you also experience, the trade-offs? Obviously the challenge to become carbon neutral or even carbon negative, but also to grow and to nurture, the innovation and the ambition that your city has. How do you achieve that?
Yeah, I think that the city has really shown that we have increased. We have over 300,000 citizens since 1990, but still we can see that we have mitigated our emissions, CO2 emissions, with 60%. So you can really see that you can combine, the prosperity and the financial side with the sustainable goals. So we are working very closely with the business community, for example, when it comes to electrifying all the mobility and transport in the city. And they see that, they also want to do an impact, but we have to be clear that we will set demands for the future. So in our procurements, when it comes to all building sector, we said that after 2030, we will not procure any, heavy transport that are not electrified. So the business community has a couple of years to change and transform. And we, from the city's perspective, are very clear that, you have this amount of years, and then you can't have a deal, or, you can't be involved in the city's procurement if you don't have access to electrified heavy transport. That is just one example. And we also have charging infrastructure in all our parking lots. And we work very closely with companies like Volvo, Volkswagen, Scania. So it's both like working together, but also to set clear targets and clear demands when you procure. And the city has, around the world, has a strong buying and purchase power. If you look at the city's potential, it's actually, if you take OECD's member states, it's actually 7.5% of the GDP. So it's a lot of purchasing power that's within the city's limits.
Yeah, I mean, I think you are also quite involved working with cities around the globe and, sharing your insights. And I think you are co-chair of the C40 steering committee and also lead on business collaboration there. So what are some of the lessons that you would like to share with other cities and those who work with cities who are, maybe at the beginning of that journey?
Both to work with pacts, so you share a common goal, and then you have a specific plans how to reach those goals, but also to use your procurement's power as a city. So that's two kind of really main focus that you can work with the business community and to set clear demands. Another example that the city of Stockholm is doing is that we have a special food procurement plan where we are very specific in what we buy in to our schools and elderly homes. We serve over almost 200,000 meals every day to children, to older people in our city. And now we said that we have a specific demands what we buy in, that it's sustainable, but it's also healthy, nutritious, and it's good for the environment. And then we can use our purchasing power to really push forward a more sustainable way of handling food. And we also want to reduce food waste with 50%. That's also in the plan. So that's other things that how the city could work very closely together with enterprises and so on. But I also think that a smart cities should use the citizens more proactively and work with much more, to ask them through real-time data, through sensors, to make them involved, because they are also smart if they are informed. So both informed consumers in the city, but also, informed citizens. For example, how is the air? Is it a good quality or not? I think that if it's not, and you publish it and make it transparent to the citizens, they will push for, to change, to push for policy that will to make the air quality better. As we've seen in cities like London, where you have Breathe London, you can do exactly the same in different cities around the world to use the citizens' engagement. And I think that, if I have to mention, but Ukraine today really shown what citizens empower can do and can bring to a country. And I think that, to involve the citizens is something I really would like to see more cities do around the world.
Yeah, that's a very powerful message, and thank you, because it is also about, these co-benefits and a joint vision, and then engaging everybody who has a stake in the city. So yeah, I think that will resonate with a lot of our listeners. So thank you so much for those insights. I'm delighted now to welcome our 4 panelists who will join me in the discussion for the next 40 minutes. We have Anna Dasgupta, President and Chief Executive of the World Resources Institute. Hello. Mark Watts, Chief Executive from C40 Cities. Claire Wildfire, Global Practice Lead, Cities from Mott MacDonald. And Sarah Burch, Canada Research Chair in Sustainability, Governance and Innovation from the University of Waterloo. Welcome to you all. You are sustainability leaders in your field, and you bring very distinct insights and experiences to our topic. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion about the role of cities in our quest for sustainability. Smart cities, resilient cities, sustainable cities, many labels exist. But what does this mean in practice? What works and what needs urgent action? And this is what I would like us to explore in the next 40 minutes. So, Annie, let's start with you. For several years, you were the global director of WRI's Ross Center for Sustainable Cities. So, how can we make cities work better for both people and the environment?
Thank you, Shannon. Thank you for having me here. Look, the case for cities, why cities at all in this conversation, is absolutely clear. Most people in the world live in cities. It is the center of economic activity. 70-80% of GDP is produced in cities. And most of the emissions come from activities from cities. So that part is very clear. Science of what to do to get to net zero in cities also becoming increasingly clear. Building, transport, materials use, consumption, it's pretty straightforward. The question is, how do you do it? And it turns out the way cities are, the reason cities were created for productivity gains, for quality of life increases, for innovation, these are all hold true in this transition to net zero. If you take, for example, transportation, the simplest, the best thing one can do, which is actually get people out of cars and have much better public transport and walking and biking for people. Now, it turns out that's great for carbon emissions, also great for cities itself. Most people in, say, Mexico or Joburg, for example, more than 50% people in those cities can't get to their jobs by public transport within 1 hour. So making public transport better not only reduces carbon emission, makes air quality better for our children in cities, what London is doing, for example, right now, but actually makes the economy work better. So that more people can actually access employment in within a given period for an hour. So this is what's beautiful about cities, is that the things we need to do get to the transition we need, it not only needs the government to do something, it needs people and it needs businesses to act together. And cities provide this incredible opportunity to bring this collective action, which is the case for everything we want to do. But cities provide the leadership, the immediacy, the election cycles that make these activities that are not only good for carbon, it's good for economy, but good for health and nature. And that's why I think all of us are focused on what can cities do and what can we learn from what cities are doing. I hope people like Mark will talk about cities, what cities are doing. The last thing I want to say, Sman, that there is no path to net zero for the world, and you saw the IPCC report today, that without actually getting cities right.
Yeah, very, very powerful reminder of the role that cities play in all our lives. Even if you don't live in a city, you are involved in what's happening in the city. And he mentioned the challenge of net zero, with cities looking for solutions to help them prosper and become carbon neutral at the same time. Mark, you work with a large group of cities. Why is net zero so critical for cities?
Well, I think with the latest IPCC report, the simple answer to that is because we're hurtling towards a level of global heating at which human civilization can't survive. And the pledges we've had from governments only recently in Glasgow would still mean that emissions will be higher in 2030 than they are today, and twice as high as they need to be to stay under 1.5 degrees. So that net zero, and net zero very early, net zero by 2030, is really critical for cities, because we need some powerful political leaders who are setting and delivering genuinely science-based climate action, so we can set a positive example, show that that action that's necessary to stop climate breakdown is possible, but also it's affordable in the short term, and that it brings many, many benefits with it, enabling people to live happier, healthier, more secure lives in the way that Arnie set out. All of the everything's on the upside here. All the stuff that seems difficult that we have to do to cut emissions actually will improve quality of life, and particularly in cities. I think the net zero 2030 target itself is also very critical for global north cities, because they've got a responsibility to the rest of the world, because it's consumption that's so high in the rich part of the world that's causing 92% of that overshoot beyond the 1.5 degree boundary, whilst 80 to 90% of the costs are felt in the global south. There's a responsibility for the richer countries to hit those decarbonisation targets much earlier.
Yeah, I mean, having the net zero ambitions there is hugely important, and I think 2030 is very ambitious. But at the same time, many cities, as you said, are already experiencing the impact of climate change and feeling the cost, and floods, heat waves, fires, windstorms. All of us remember pictures, and some of us will have been directly impacted. And yeah, just this month, the IPCC's new landmark report outlined the damages that climate is already causing. So how prepared are cities also for current and future climate change? I mean, there's the strategy to become net zero, but what are cities doing in actually response to these climate impacts? A smart city needs to be able to cope with this. So, Sarah, I think your research explores transformation and change and how cities can become green and resilient. So do you see synergies between mitigation and adaptation?
I do, absolutely. And Annie and Mark have both highlighted the sort of urgency of these multiple priorities that intersect with one another in an urban space and in our cities. And we have these pressing net zero targets, but as the impacts of climate change become more severe, more frequent, more costly, we get to be concerned that we're literally just keeping our heads above water and grappling with those climate impacts as they wash over us. And the net zero targets then take the back bench. So we absolutely are faced with this challenge of doing mitigation, reducing our greenhouse gas emissions at the same time as we're protecting communities from those escalating impacts. And cities are the perfect place to do both of those at once. So, a classic example, of course, is that in low-lying cities that are prone to storms and storm surges and flooding and this kind of thing, the classic response would be to build a giant concrete seawall or dike to protect the community from that storm action and from those waves. Instead, constructed wetlands, using nature, bringing nature into the equation so that we're actually building an ecology that sinks carbon. Those green and growing things suck up carbon and store it for us, which is great. It purifies water. It protects our communities from the floods, offers, opportunities for recreation or improved public health, air quality, biodiversity. So many of those priorities that we have, we can accomplish simultaneously if we consider the two sides of the climate change coin as urgent priorities, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where the term sustainability comes in, because to me that sort of symbolizes, this joint effort to try and achieve, not just adaptation, mitigation, but, economic development and looking after people, more equality. I mean, the list goes on, and we're talking about cities in very abstract terms, but, who within cities is actually responsible? I think you mentioned a couple of times political leaders, but obviously what happens in a city is also driven by role of business, for example. And I know, Sarah, your work looked into this. And, I've worked on multi-sectoral partnerships in cities where you bring together business, government, science, civil society. So I think, Claire, you have experience working with both the public and private entities on this sustainable cities agenda. And maybe you can share some insights on where do you see the role, particularly of the private sector in this quest?
That is a brilliant question. Thank you. And I suppose so. I'm coming at this from the coalface because Mott MacDonald, my company, we design the systems that keep cities running. So the roads, the railways, the schools, the hospitals, their energy systems. And in this time of disruption, I see that local business and local government ultimately want the same thing because they want a long-term resilient future for their city. And I think we've touched on the fact that if you craft that conversation right, you can align local investment with the direction that the city wants and needs to go. So public and private stakeholders working together to look at where different decisions will take them. So doing scenario planning, then deciding the future that they want for their city, and then collectively making that happen. And so in this conversation, what I see is that whilst the public sector is bringing, say, the convening power, the ability to set direction, rewarding good behaviour through things like planning, local taxation, sometimes pump priming investment for low or no rates of return, the private sector is bringing the skills, the investment appetite to scale up fast if the conditions are right. So the crucial thing is to take time to understand what it looks like from other people's perspectives, so that the public sector can understand those crucial private sector risk levers and mitigate them in the direction that they're setting in things like providing land that will unlock different decisions and things. And I just wanted to finish with an example. So I was in a meeting this morning with the Greater London Authority, and they have done some of this convening, and they mentioned that each of the infrastructure providers has identified what they've called a collaboration specialist. So that's sort of underlining that idea that you definitely need to work on what good collaboration looks like if we're to move forwards in the way that we all want.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that example. And I think it is clear that transformation to sustainable city, presents opportunities, but also requires significant investment. So, I would like to ask the panel whether we're actually seeing progress in financing smart cities, and if not, what is holding it back? And maybe Mark, you could kick us off and share your thoughts. I mean, the cities you work with, where are they in terms of accessing finance for these required changes?
Well, at the moment, it's still the case that city governments themselves are financing the lion's share of climate action in their city, which is clearly not a tenable proposition for the the scale of transformation that's needed. And it's an odd one, because the kind of barriers that are put up to that finance flowing would be, first, got to focus on jobs. But the research now is really conclusive. There's no problem of jobs in a climate safe economy, quite the reverse. C40's own research shows that if we invested what's needed to deliver the targets against 1.5 degrees for the next decade, so halving emissions across all C40 cities for the next decade, it would add a net 80 million jobs across C40 cities. And that's about a third more than any other scenario we could come up with, a kind of business as usual scenario. So there's no problem on that score. There's clearly no problem of finance per se. We're only talking about globally 2% of GDP by most estimates to deliver our climate targets. I think the big problem still remains enticing finance away from where it's not needed to where it is needed. So still too much investment going into the bad stuff, into the fossil fuel investment, too money not flowing equitably. It's still far too little climate finance flowing to the global south, and particularly missing for adaptation. But you're seeing a lot of ingenuity now, I think, both in the private sector and the public. It's been really striking looking at Bogota recently, which has now got the biggest electric bus fleet outside of China in a relatively poor country, and which has been partly financed by essentially removing subsidies from private car owners, i.e. introducing parking charges for the first time, starting to introduce what will become a kind of road user charging. Or you're seeing cities that are really deciding to create and shape markets, not just try and tinker to correct market failure. So Seoul committing that it will retrofit every public building in the city in the space of 3 years, and requiring by regulation that every public building has to have solar power built into it, which really has completely ignited the markets for retrofit and for solar in the city. Or, similarly in the US, the way that New York, Washington have set really tough building performance standards now, which are expected in New York's case alone to generate about $20 billion of mostly private investment, 40,000 jobs. So I think you're seeing that kind of that leadership, but still we're lacking, particularly in the global south. The big development banks are not investing in urban climate action at anything like the level that's needed, and that's holding back then private investment from flowing in behind.
Yeah, thank you. Would someone else from the panel like to comment on potential barriers in this?
I'm happy to jump in. Just to build on Mark's point, I mean, from our work and some of the work we have done with C40, the two big things that's not happening. It's pretty obvious, right, from the first comments that you heard from all four of us, that the action in cities is imperative to get to 50% by 2030 or net zero for the world. However, two things are not happening. One is for cities to thrive or to attract finance beyond the city's own finance, it absolutely has to be part of the national decarbonization strategy, what called NDCs. And our research shows it's not happening. Only one third of the NDCs even talk about cities, and much smaller portion actually in their climate strategy include city action. So if national strategies do not incorporate city level action, which is majority of the emission, there is a gap there, right? And the national strategies normally talk about energy transition, transport transition in a broader sense. Hopefully in the future we'll talk about agriculture, but it doesn't talk about cities. Not enough. I mean, some of them do, but very few, 7-8% of them. So that's one big barrier that needs to change. I hope we're making small progress. We may have to make dramatic progress there. The second, as you heard from both Claire and Mark, I mean, our accounting shows there's infrastructure investment in the world that we need to transition is about $1.5 to $2 billion a year, trillion dollars, 2 to 3% of the GDP, the world GDP. That finance doesn't sit in multilateral development banks, meaning world banks of the world. That finance sits with private capital. And that private capital is not flowing to city level investments, not for project level problems, but also intermediation problem at the national level, meaning national levels are not allowing as much as they should to flow. And something positive happened in Glasgow, right? Big financial institutions pledged net zero, $130 trillion worth of financial institution. They have to put money somewhere now, right, to become net zero. They're not going to stop lending money. So there is a huge opportunity now with that supply side thing getting pushed for us to all work together to get the money to where it's required to infrastructure investments in developing country cities. So Denmark doesn't really have a problem raising money for an offshore wind farm. So that's not a problem we need to solve. What we need to solve in outside Eastern India, do we get renewable energy on offshore renewable energy? That's not getting funded. So I think there are these two big barriers that I think collectively we need to work on to unlock the finance that cities absolutely need.
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I'd like to add a different scale of perspective, I guess, from the viewpoint of small and medium-sized firms, which make up, in fact, the bulk of private sector companies on the planet. And in the Canadian context, for instance, 9 out of 10 people who work in the private sector work in small businesses, not in large businesses. And there's a real finance challenge there when it comes to making progress on sustainability priorities in small firms. They tend to be very capacity strapped. They have very fine profit margins. They don't have a lot of room to wiggle, and they have a fairly narrow set of expertise. They're very good at doing what they do, small firms, but not so great at rolling with these incredible, wicked problems, these new and emerging challenges related to climate change. And the challenges that they face, the small firms that I've worked with over the many years that I've done this work, is that when they're trying to attract investors and they are making a sustainability-oriented proposition, the payback on that is a little bit longer than a traditional firm might offer a venture capitalist or investor of some type. And they need investors that are willing to wait for those returns and see environmental and social benefit on par with profit as other, important roles that the private sector can play in making our communities more sustainable. So, a community of investors that acknowledges these longer payback periods and the value of environmental and social benefit in the private sector would go a long way to accelerating transformation in small firms.
Thank you. So I've noticed on that aspect that's bring back returns that are acceptable to the investor community. And some of them, like energy efficiency, are extremely tricky, even in wealthy nations. And so I've seen in the UK a pilot of bundling some of those solutions so that you end up with a bundled, not just of the different types of solutions, some with higher rates of return, some with lower, but also across cities. That definitely makes it more attractive to investors. So maybe we'll see some of these solutions being crafted in the global north and then being passed over to the global south once they've sort of ironed out some of the tricky bits.
Yeah, thanks for bringing this in. I mean, I think it's also about harnessing, the role, but also learning from good examples. I mean, harnessing the role of small businesses. I think, Sarah, the point you made, they play a huge role underpinning economic activity, but they're also often disproportionately impacted by climate impacts and events, and not really having the tools and resources at hand. And many of them don't have insurance, or they don't have business continuity plans. So, I think working with small businesses, both on resilience, but also net zero, seems to be an important aspect. I mean, are there examples that anyone on the panel is aware of where that's been sort of supported by cities, and where this idea of there's a city economy driving this?
I've got an example. It's possibly not at a scale that's going to solve the problem majorly, but so a former power station site in the UK is being redeveloped by the energy company Engie, now Equans. And so for those 2,000 homes, they're going to make them low carbon, but they've now got a collaboration going with the local authority, looking at whether the scale up to the whole of the town of Rugeley, which is where the power station site is, so that you can affect the price point, because to Engie, not 2,000 homes, but 20,000 homes suddenly becomes something that they would step up and push forwards and improve the scalability and the economies of scale. So that's where you can bring together the private sector know-how with the public sector convening power to make a change happen.
Yeah, well, thanks for bringing in that example. I mean, talking about private sector, public sector collaboration, I think another important point in all of this is, and I think, Annie, you've said this, cities also need to be people smart and working with and for those who make up the city. So, how do individuals, from rich property owners to the homeless on the street, how do they play a role, and how can a city be people smart?
I think smart. You hear a lot about smart cities. I think people smart is what we need. The smart cities. I think Claire made a very good point earlier. We strongly believe, and the evidence shows that what we need to build is actually a coalition between with city government, businesses, and community. For not for moral reasons, but also for practical reasons. Because city governments are a 4-year cycle in most places, 6 years in Latin America. Big transformations don't, it takes longer. You need to hold on to the transformation as you go from one government to another. I think great example is London. Actually, Mark was part of Ken Livingstone's government, which was seen to be left leaning, but set up the motion what's happening today. And it says governments have changed many times over, both left and right, but the direction of travel hasn't changed. That is what we need to happen, that kind of a coalition of society and government. I want to add a different dimension to people centered you raised. Most poor people in the world soon will live in cities, which was never true before. That is going to happen. 1 billion people today live in slum-like condition in cities. 1 billion people out of the 3.5 billion that live. And I want to build on the Sarah's point of productivity and small firms. Some cities we work in the global south, 60, 65, 70% of the population are in the informal economy. So think about that. So productivity of city is very dependent on how informal economy, so to speak, works. So one, you want to make sure this economy is part of the economy, that you're absolutely intentionally supporting this economy. So for example, if you want to provide energy services, you don't think about the 20% of formal firms. You actually think about the 60% of informal firms, or impact of floods that takes place in slum that completely impacts what happens to household level productivity. So give you an example. I mean, in Ahmedabad, for example, city worked with community organizations, say one arm of Seva, to get cool roof program across the slums, meaning painting roof, to reduce temperature, to increase all household level productivity during the day that was taking place. These are the kind of partnership we need over and over again across all the cities we're talking about. There are about 5,000 cities with more than 100,000 people. So that is the group of peace cities we're talking about to get our coalitions right and the solutions between public-private sectors together.
Yeah, thank you for bringing this up. And I know many of you mentioned also, cities north, south, and learning from each other. I mean, Mark, how does this work in your alliance, and how do you facilitate that? Because I think, your members come, basically from all around the world. And, is there a fairly well-established sort of knowledge exchange or a sort of support system that cities have established?
Yeah, it's one of the wonderful things about working with cities is certainly in C40, it's about half and half global north, global south membership, but everybody joins as equals, and the whole basis is about collaboration of knowledge sharing between cities, because although there's incredible differences in terms of economic development, in terms of geography, in terms of climate impacts at the moment, actually the basic problems that each of those mayors are dealing with is quite similar because of the scale of the city, in our case, quite large cities, mostly 3 million plus. So you see as much kind of south to north knowledge sharing as north to south these days. And I'm particularly thinking, perhaps unexpected things. It really has been China and the global south that's really been driving forward in public transport, particularly around electrification in recent years. We're seeing a tremendous amount of innovation now in the face of climate impacts in global south cities that's starting to make global north cities really take a look. And actually, to some of what Arnie was just saying, particularly around the engagement with community in cities. And it's I think it's one of the reasons that gives me optimism, because you can really see between cities the kind of international collaboration that is essential if the whole of the world is to overcome climate breakdown, and is currently not being possible for intergovernmental collaboration to achieve, but you can see at a city scale, not only between city governments, but also, as everybody's talked about, that's also then a platform for bringing together individuals, the business sector, the climate movement, and we see often organised labour as well now working all together around city programmes. And what you need from city governments is to set the direction, set the leadership, but then welcome every contribution that wants to help deliver it.
I think there's a really powerful ingredient to this, which I mentioned earlier, which is scenario planning, which works with the citizens just as much as it does with any of the other stakeholders. And we've got a phrase, share the bad news as well as the good, which is communicate to the citizens that there may be short-term pain, but we're heading towards long-term gain, and show them the different versions of the future and help them become part of the preferable future rather than something else. So we're really passionate about bringing the citizens on the conversation, help them see the different versions of the future that may exist and be part of the solution.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, the sort of transparency about this. And I remember not that long ago, cities were also not very keen to share information about risk. There was a concern that you're being stigmatized and that, you rather want to hide the fact that, you've been flooded and because nobody's going to invest in you. So I think that sort of signals a challenge that cities are also facing. I mean, on top of all the pressure, all the other pressure that they're facing. And I guess for us, I'm a big advocate of these integrated solutions that you've all been mentioning there. But I guess in reality, I mean, there are quite some hard choices, I think, that cities are also going to be making. And I think I completely buy into this, it has long-term advantages and, we need to focus on the positives. But, how do we make sure that, if the going gets tough, if the costs are rising and if this is actually triggering some tough decisions, that we still see these integrated strategies, and how can cities embrace that? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
I like to jump in there because Claire and Ani and Mark have all alluded to issues around justice essentially, and you are as well, Swenja, that we are in a place where we need to be looking forward to a desirable future, as Claire says. What is the future we're trying to build together? But be very frank and very honest about who our cities are currently not serving, even now, to say nothing of 20, 30, 40 years in the future. And then plan accordingly and think very carefully about how to elevate those marginalized voices and how to ensure that, it's very unfortunately historically been the case that marginalized communities, that poor and underserved communities are often more exposed to climate extremes and to pollution and lower air quality and this sort of thing. Also, as we begin to decarbonize, however, we run the risk of this, what we could call green gentrification, or creating these communities that are very efficient when it comes to energy use and very safe from climate impacts, but completely inaccessible and unaffordable to a growing majority of people. So the justice and equity dimension is central, not just from a moral perspective, but if we want to accelerate these transformations towards deeply desirable sustainability futures, justice has to be a core part of that conversation, I think.
Yeah, very important reminder, I think, for all of us. Maybe before we come to our closing round, I just wanted to bring in the what many call nature-based solutions, or, the news of nature in helping cities become more sustainable. And, we see urban greening, green roofs, natural flood storage, sustainable urban drainage system, carbon sinks. Many cities have actually started working with, their natural capital assets. Are we on the right track? And, clearly that offers a lot of co-benefits and it's very promising. But are we really seeing this being embraced by cities? Or can you maybe share some examples?
I'm happy to go first. I'm sure everyone has examples on this. I think the cities are very excited about this possibility. We have a program that we started with other partners called Cities for Forests. So which is focused on not only greening cities, but making the connection with the consumption that is taking place in cities to faraway forests. So it is a program about greening cities themselves, the region, but also faraway forests, because a lot of things that happen in cities impact forests that citizens don't see because they're far away from it. We actually had exponential expansion of cities wanting to work on it, simply because the connection between the cities and the future long-term forest, but also the immense benefit of nature-based solutions that Sarah already talked about that exist, or I think Claire, you talked about, exist in cities. And things about watershed management and things like that people talk about. But there's a huge increase of heat island effects that's going on in cities in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia that has dramatic outcomes for nature-based solutions. If you look at Medellin, for example, there's a measurable 2-degree difference in temperature just by one city's greening program. So on my observation, and I'd love to hear, Mark, from your membership, there is a real excitement of cities. And as I said, I think city leadership, not just what cities are, the leaders on the cities has a huge future of their ambition, of what they want to do, not only for the city, but for the globe. And this is what we have seen for the last 10 years that has been shifting. And some of us have been arguing for it. I hope a lot more of us actually see the opportunity of leadership at the city level and grow it.
Yeah, if I may, I certainly think there's huge enthusiasm around nature-based solutions in cities, and the pandemic has exacerbated that. Exacerbate is not the right word; it's not a positive word, is it? But it's enhanced it, partly because citizens' greater appreciation of green and public space, having been confined in lockdowns, but also for practical purposes. So you see, Quezon City in Manila, for example, is now investing heavily in urban agriculture because of the supply problems they experienced at the real pinch points of the pandemic in terms of just getting food into the city, but also because here's an opportunity to improve some flood management and to improve the air quality in the city. I think the problem is, it comes back to one of your earlier questions, is there isn't at the moment, to my mind, a working financing model for investing in nature-based solutions in cities. It just, the finance markets don't understand it in terms of those really long-term benefits. And it kind of gets us back to that question of being able to match the long-term investors with the programs that cities are trying to put in place.
Well, many thanks for that. I'm looking at the time. I was planning to give you all 30 seconds in the final round. I think I have to cut that down. So let's see if you pass the elevator pitch here. So I would like to just very quickly ask each of you, what change can be made to cities right now that will deliver the greatest impact? So, just to put you on the spot, if there's one big change that you want to bring to the attention of the audience, now's the chance. Who wants to start?
I can start because it builds on the last point, nature-based solutions, and the point Mark made. I think we desperately need to quantify the benefits of the resilience and the nature-based solutions, and that probably brings in more a data-driven collecting of information that allows you to see not just the single thing that you're tracking, but the co-benefits angle. So that's my one.
Thanks. Next.
I'll jump in. Yes, so I would say that in our cities, we need a massive mobilization of resources and support to accelerate transformations in small businesses. They need financing, they need technical know-how, they need relationships with like-minded firms that have done this before and know how it goes. They're the sort of living, breathing fabric of our cities, and without them, our net zero targets won't be reached. So a one-stop shop, resources, skills, tax incentives, whatever will help small firms along is much needed, I think.
Thanks. Mark?
I love both of those, but I'm going to go for a technocratic one, being the ex-city government person. And I think climate budgeting, where you have to link every financial decision that's made in the city government, could be a company as well, to the delivery of the climate target. So you can't spend money unless you can prove that it's going to help, not hinder delivering the climate targets.
And
Love that one.
Annie?
We just don't want just a low carbon city. We want thriving cities where you want to raise your family, you want to come and job. That's the city we want. We just finished a long-term research project. Turns out if you make the cities work for the poor 50%, it's not only better for the economy, it's better for carbon, it's better for nature. So that's my radical idea.
Well, excellent. And thank you all so much for your contributions. And also many thanks to Stockholm's Mayor Anna König Jerlmyr for her thoughts. And many thanks to the audience for joining us. And please stay tuned for other events during the Sustainability Week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.